Hello everyone, I'm standing in front of the House of Lords in England, and I have with me the Right Honourable the Lord Naseby of the House of Lords of the British Parliament. Good day, sir.
It's wonderful to see you here in London.
Yes, and Lord Naseby, I think you have been widely known in Sri Lanka for someone who has always raced in Sri Lanka's defence, very vocal about Sri Lankan affairs. And I'd like to know how your interest in Sri Lanka begins.
Well, I started actually working in India for the Reckitt and Coleman Group in Calcutta. And my boss called me in one morning and said, I've got good news and bad news. Good news is you are promoted. Bad news, you and your wife have to go to Colombo. Well, I knew that Colombo was an awful lot nicer than Calcutta.
It was certainly not bad news.
There was no bad news there at all.
Right. And I also have with me a statement that you issued on Saturday pertaining to Sri Lankan affairs. And I think, Sir Lord Naseby, if we touch on that before we start on discussing more about your interests and some of the statements that you've been making at the House of Lords constantly pertaining to Sri Lanka and the UNHRC.
Yeah. Well, on June the 28th, the Security Committee of Parliament, so that's both members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, published a report on security and what we call rendition. That was a situation that arose after 9/11 and the terrible terrorist Twin Towers with the aircraft flying into them. And obviously both the US and the UK decided they had to do something to track terrorists down. Right. That we all understood. What we did not understand as representatives of the people was the extent to which they would go in terms of rendition, which means capturing somebody who you think is a terrorist somewhere in the world and transporting them back to the States for interrogation. But it was more than an interrogation. The evidence appears to be that there was torture involved, and we've heard about waterboarding and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
Well, I find that unacceptable. I don't think that's part of human rights. And then I suddenly thought at home, thinking about Sri Lanka, that after the war, the Sri Lankan army was accused of a whole lot of alleged war crimes. And as you may recall, a couple of years ago now, had a Freedom of Information inquiry into Colonel Gash and his dispatches as the UK Defence Attaché based in Colombo. He was there in the field from January 2009 right up to May the 18th or 19th when the Tigers were defeated. So I thought there might be something interesting in those dispatches. There was. That proved to me and I think everybody else outside that there never was a policy to kill Tamil civilians, and secondly, the numbers killed certainly were not 40,000, which is what the UN suggested was a probable number. Maybe some people in the UN said as many as 100,000, but the figures there were 5,000 to 6,000. Now that prompted me to think about, well, at the same time that we, that is Sri Lankan, those of us who take an interest, were realizing what was happening in Sri Lanka, which was a war, yes, but not with all these torture and other dimensions on top. At the same time as you were doing that as a country, the UK and the USA were doing some of these horrendous humanitarian activities. So I thought, that's wrong. And I've now called upon the UK and the USA to withdraw the motion against Sri Lanka. Because, you know, the Sri Lankans were not involved in this sort of thing. And it's quite wrong that there's this motion. So I think it should be withdrawn.
Right. And Lord Naseby, if we go back to the resolutions brought forth against Sri Lanka in the UN and the one that was co-sponsored by Sri Lanka, what are your personal views and observances?
Well, because Sri Lanka were in a difficult position. They could have said, no, we're not going to cooperate at all, or we will cooperate because we think we are innocent. There may have been the occasional infringe, I'm sure there was, you know, and it's quite right we should investigate the white flag situation, and there were one or two others perhaps. But basically I think your government said we will cooperate because we're innocent, and we want to prove that we're innocent. So that's why I think you were right to join in. And I now see on the ground the Missing Persons Commission. Very good. I want to see some published results from it, and so does the rest of the world. So it's high time there were some published results, that people have been interviewed, that people have either been found, in which case of course they're not missing, and there are a fair number of alleged missing people who've reappeared in Tamil Nadu or Canada or the UK. But assuming they are genuine missing people, then those families do need to have some compensation and be looked after.
Right. Lord Naseby, if I also refer to a statement you made in November 2017, what you mentioned about civilian casualties during the final stages of the conflict in Sri Lanka, you referred to the classified document of the UN as something that had guessed the figure of the final stages of the conflict, because it was stated that it was 40,000 civilian casualties, but you in fact said it was just 7,000.
At the time Rajapaksa was working alongside the UN, and then out of the blue, the inquiry done by 3 people who didn't come to the country produces this figure out of the air, and that's quite wrong. And we now have the evidence that that's quite wrong, and I'm waiting for the UN to say it's quite wrong. There's nothing wrong in life. You can make a mistake, but for heaven's sake admit it. It's a terrible mistake. We now know from the census, from all the other evidence, from the graves and everything else, that at the most it was maybe 6,000. Other than that, we don't know how many of them were actually LTE soldiers who'd thrown away their uniforms. So the UN needs to recognise that nobody as far as I know in Sri Lanka, wants not to cooperate. They want to cooperate, but they want to cooperate on a truthful basis, not on some fictitious, made-up basis where somebody has been got at by an element of the diaspora or whatever.
Shouldn't the UK play a major role in going to the UN, especially as a co-sponsor to the resolutions, and especially because of a country that has colonial history with Sri Lanka, to go in and make it clear at the UNHRC, and especially because the US has also withdrawn from the global body?
You're quite right, we should. And that's really what I've been talking about for some years here now, and we'll keep it up. And I hope in the end we'll persuade them. Of course, we just lost the Foreign Secretary, as you may know, so we have a new one to convince. But we'll keep at it, yeah. We'll keep at it.
All right. Also, Lord Naseby, I think the international community says, although that these resolutions will help keep the Sri Lankan government in check and allow the minority rights be won. What are your views?
Well, minority rights are always important. Of course they're important. And I know your government, the present government, are looking at some form of devolution to the provinces or the regions. And that's something that I welcome. We've had devolution in this country. Northern Ireland has slightly different laws to Scotland, and slightly different laws to Wales, and slightly different laws to England. But obviously not the major things, usually to do with local government in that area. And I think it's understandable. In your case, though, I can't see the need for having any split. I mean, you've got the northern region, you've got the northwest region, you've got the southern region, you've got the eastern region. They're all entities in their own right, in my personal view.
If not for the resolutions, sir, what mechanism do you propose and suggest for Sri Lanka going forward to, as a solution to what is referred to as the national question of Sri Lanka?
It's not really for me to propose. I'm not there to...
according to your observances and what you've seen.
I can only provide some guidance and some thoughts. But you're a sovereign country. It's not for me to really perform on that area. I've got to watch the human rights dimension. I listen to the ICRC. They're an independent, wonderful organisation. And if you took that other key issue that's still rumbling away underneath, which is the alleged torture. Now, I have asked the ICRC, quietly and privately, 3 different senior people at different times on 3 different visits. Have you seen any evidence, and they're everywhere in Sri Lanka, as you know as well as I do, of genuine torture as defined by the Geneva Convention? The answer I've had each time has been no. We have seen some heavy handling, and that's to be deplored, but not real torture. That against the report that I mentioned right at the beginning of this interview, where it was real torture, shows that there is a big difference between what the West has allowed to happen in relation to terrorists and what Sri Lanka has done in relation to terrorists.
Right, and I think that's about the interview. Thank you very much, Sir Lord Naseby, and I think your interest in Sri Lanka will continue to be focused in the national issue, and we know that you follow cricket more than football here, although the World Cup is closer to home in England.
Well, cricket's wonderful, and I've got a young man called Prasanna playing cricket for Northamptonshire, and he's very good. And before that we had Chaminda Vas and one or two others, so we have close ties still with Sri Lanka.
Right, thank you very much,
Pleasure's
sir.
mine.
We had with us the Right Honourable Sir Lord Naseby of the House of Lords of the British Parliament joining us on the show. Do stay with us, we'll be back with more.